Okay, so again, welcome to Pluto and Aquarius Astro Circle, where we're just going to see what happens. I was really curious to see what form this lecture would take because there's a lot of information. I don't know if you have noticed this, but there's a lot going on in Astrolandia this month. It is a lot to keep track of. So we're nearing the end of the month. We still have Pluto moving into Aquarius. We still have Mars finally switching signs, which I think is great. And then will things chill out after that? Probably not, but it won't be like one big major thing after another. But one of the things I was thinking about going into this, going into this year really, and knowing that like people are going to be like, Pluto's going into Aquarius, is really like the internal urge I have to like therefore downplay things, because that's how my stubborn resistance comes in, but also because we're dealing with a slow moving planet changing signs. Pluto won't be thoroughly into Aquarius to stay until September of 2024. So we're not really dealing with Pluto and Aquarius yet. We're dealing with a dialogue between Pluto and Capricorn and Pluto and Aquarius. Okay, so like just kind of keeping in mind that, this is true for the moon changing signs, this is true for Saturn changing signs, whatever it is, we're never talking about the ending of a story. It's not like we get to close the book on the chapter that is Pluto and Capricorn, and we're going to talk about what, Pluto and Capricorn means as well. But thinking about astrology as a teleological process, and so it's something that doesn't have a definite beginning and end. It's a story that flows through time, and as you kind of participate in the journey of it, you learn more about what it means. So especially when Pluto is involved, it's important to note that there's no taking it back. What has been opened up, what has been exposed, what has been, made clear to us or is starting to be made clear for us relative to the lessons of the transit, won't go away. We have to build based on what we've learned. And so that gets into kind of like Pluto as an evolutionary signature. It is talking about the evolution of our individual souls, our collective soul, our collective journey, our personal journey. And therefore, I don't think, although I sometimes, I did this with Saturn leaving Aquarius, I was like, yay, it's over, right? But that's more just like the feisty human in me. The wise elder in me is just compelled to say, remember that, it is flowing through time. And so I think it can be helpful looking at this upcoming Pluto ingress into Aquarius as, again, this dialogue with what has happened in the last however many years of Pluto in Capricorn. How many years is it? About 15. So I think before I like pull up ye old PowerPoint, I'm curious if anyone wants to share either through voice or chat, what you've heard about this transit, what you're thinking about with this transit, what you're wondering about with this transit. Does anyone care to share any of that?
I'm going to say not this one specifically, but I did a workshop with you. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but about the outer planets and about how they kind of have these, the moon, it changes signs every day and a half or whatever, but where these are kind of like big phases and they're big, big from a time scale sort of thing, like a big group that's going to be, it'll take a while to suss out what it is, as we're going through it, and then after the fact.
Absolutely. And so that's that kind of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and Saturn to some extent take such a long time, like their orbital period is so large that we are dealing with more of these kind of like historical eras rather than just like fleeting filters. And we'll talk about that a little bit more for sure. Thanks, Christina.
I've said this before and I like to talk about it, but I feel like Pluto and Aquarius we're gonna get like more definitive proof and like more definitive contact with like extraterrestrials. I think like the UFO sightings that have been coming around, like I feel like that's very like a preview into Pluto and Aquarius. And I feel like there's gonna be a connection there.
Yeah, it's very weird. um, I fall into a trap a lot of times of paying attention to TikTok more than I do the news. And there's a lot of content on TikTok about these, like, they're not even calling them UFOs anymore. They're like unidentified something else. They changed the acronym. But there's a lot going on with that. And then I'm like, is that being covered in the media, in like the mainstream media at all? And then I'll get something from my mom that's like a news article, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's still there. So yeah, we get like unidentified flying objects, weirdness. Aquarius is often associated with the alien, quite literally, right? So whether it's like a being from outer space, or parts of ourself that feel weird, or just things that we don't understand. Yeah, good point. And like Carl Jung has a whole book on essentially like the UFO experience and how it is, a really potent and active part of the human psyche, that we tend to like make these stories around things that we don't explain. And so UFOs being like a fairly modern phenomena, although I don't think it is. Anyway, cool. Thanks for bringing that up. Anything else? Okay. Let me share my screen. I should at least like do myself the favor of looking at the notes that I have written down in front of me. To see if there's anything else I wanted to say there. Okay. So before I kind of launch in, because I know we've got folks from all different levels of astro knowing, I just want to say a little bit about what we're talking about when I say things like a world transit. So Pluto entering Aquarius is a world transit. It is something that will be highly identifiable at the collective level on the world stage. You'll see it in the news. So like I talk a lot about developing your archetypal eye, looking for the archetypes in the news, in the world around you, in your day-to-day life, so that you can get to know them on your own terms. World transits are really freaking cool. This is actually like what brought me into astrology as a career, was when I discovered that you could look at the outer planets in combination with what's happening, societally speaking, historically speaking, to understand essentially like sociology and anthropology, because I'm a social sciences nerd. And I was like, what? And then I read all of a book called Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, where he charts the outer planets in hard aspect to each other in terms of what was going on in society. And it was just like, so, you can make this personal by looking at where you have Aquarius in your chart. So Pluto will be moving into that area or staying in that area, depending on what house system you're using. And so we're really just what with Pluto and Aquarius, we're talking about an upcoming 20-year period. Okay, so as you see here, the first ingress, the first entrance is March 23rd. So tomorrow, but then Pluto's going to station retrograde and it's going to move back into Capricorn. All right, so then it'll re-enter Aquarius again January 20th of 2024, and it'll be there for the bulk of 2024, and then it's going to retrograde again back into Capricorn. And then it'll make its final entrance. So it'll go there to stay in November of 2024, and it'll stay there until 2043. What will the world even look like then? And then because these movements are rarely, they rarely stick on the first pass, it'll then go into Pisces, retrograde back out, and then back into Aquarius, and then hit Pisces again to stay. that is a wrong date. I bet that's supposed to say 2044 right there. Okay. So as I've already said, we're going to have to talk a bit about the shift between Pluto and Capricorn and Pluto and Aquarius. And so a lot of this, at least for the beginning, is going to be about mundane astrology. And so I prefer the term like archetypal astrology, but what we're talking about is like world events in a lot of ways. And then we'll make it more personal probably towards the end. And so a lot of times what I'll do to start off this kind of outer planet lecture is I will have you reflect, like for those of you who were here last month, I had you reflect on what had happened since Saturn had been in Saturn ruled signs. So back into 2018. It's a little bit more unwieldy because Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008. And so, what it's doing is forming kind of like an undercurrent of things. And so many other things take place. So many other astrological things take place in that period of time that give more texture, that like bring out specific themes. And so, you can totally reflect on your life since 2008, but I bet you can say a lot has changed, right? Just because it's been a huge amount of time. Some of you were probably teenagers then, right? Like we've all gone through like major life passages in the last 15, 16 years. So just keeping that in mind. So let's talk about Pluto. I have a very wordy quote here to start us off because I came across it when I was looking through a book called The Archetypal, Archetypal Cosmology by Chiron LaGrice. And it says, the universal principle of depth, power, and transformation, 3 pretty solid keywords for Pluto. Pluto manifests in the elemental force of nature, ever destroying and creating, ensuring that life is always dying to the old and being born to the new, symbolized by the alchemical Ouroboros, the tail-ending serpent, eating serpent or dragon, consuming itself in the perpetual cycle of instinctual life. In Jungian psychology, Pluto is associated with the dark power repressed in the shadow that finds expression in our drives, obsessions, and compulsions. It's connected to, with Dionysian passion, demonic possession, shamanic dismemberment, the binding grip of fate, imposing on us a calling and pulling us inexorably into our depths for rebirth and transformation. So like Pluto's kind of a big deal. I know that astronomy would be like, no, it's not, it's a dwarf planet. But in astrology, it's a big deal. And so I want to just kind of go back through this and just pull out the keywords that are so important to Pluto. I already said depth, power, and transformation, but elemental forces of nature. So it's a chthonic force that is associated with kind of like earth-based deities, and also things like tsunamis and volcanoes and earthquakes. So the forces of the earth. Alchemy, repression, shadow, our instinctive drives, our obsessions, our compulsions. But in that, it's really important to remember that as heavy or as scary as these things can sound, Pluto is ultimately about rebirth and regeneration and transformation, okay? So it's the compost heap. Something goes to die, decay, and become something new, right? It gives minerals to the soil, and then the rose bush grows. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind, I think, especially in a secular culture, especially in a culture where we're kind of taught that like death is the end, that the cycles of nature, the cycles of the earth, remind us that what dies come back to life. Okay, there is no kind of like final thing because we're always becoming something new. And so I think that's, especially important with Pluto because you can get kind of stuck in like the shadowier manifestations of it. And so remembering consciously that it's about regeneration can be really helpful. And so another way of thinking about Pluto, or like remembering what Pluto is about, relating to Pluto, is remembering that with the outer planets, what was happening societally when they were discovered is indicative of their meaning. So Pluto was born, discovered in 1930, 1932. One of those two. I can't believe I've forgotten. But it was discovered at the same time as the detonation of the first nuclear bomb. So even just the image of the mushroom cloud is a really important image for Plutonian consciousness, because it is that image of, you know, again, like this great power emerging from the depths. It also coincides with the rise of fascism, the beginnings of the Holocaust, and so kind of like the really dark currents of what humanity is capable of. You know, genocide was not a new thing, but it hadn't been seen at that scale before. It coincides with the kind of like the criminal underground becoming a thing. It coincides with the beginnings of Jungian depth psychology. So like Freudian psychology got its beginnings at the end of the 1800s, but Jung went through his whole process in the beginning of the 1900s. And by the time we get to the 1930s is when he is, heavy quotes, discovering the unconscious, discovering a psychological language to describe what happens in our dream worlds, to describe our inner imagery, to describe shadow, which is one of his big contributions to psychology. So Pluto is also associated with the shadow, and this notion that like when we acknowledge and integrate what's unconscious within us, then we free up energy, right? There's regenerative energy, there's creative energy that comes forward. That's very Plutonian. Keywords that I don't know if I mentioned would be things like seduction, magnetism, volcanic, obsession. Okay, yeah, I think I've said most of my keywords already. So as I have already mentioned somewhat, it's important to note that, sorry, I just got distracted because I've started saying important instead of important, and I don't know when that happened, but it's happening regularly. Okay, anyway. So Pluto has an irregular orbit. Most planets spend a pretty predictable amount of time making their way around the zodiac belt. So making their way around the sun, right? So the Earth takes 365 days to move around the sun. Saturn takes about 27.9 or 28.3, right in that range. Okay, it's like it's highly consistent. And in that, these planets take this about the same amount of time in each sign. So in each zone of the sky, right? The sun takes a month through each zone. Jupiter takes 12-ish, 13-ish years to make it around the zone, but it's spending the same amount of time in each sign. So Pluto consistently takes about 250 years to make its way around the zodiac, but because its orbit is elliptical, it spends a different amount of time in the signs. So what I have pretty unclearly shown down here, you'll see in the middle, these bolded ones, it spends the longest amount of time in Taurus and the shortest amount of time in Scorpio. It spends about 30 years in Taurus and about 14, 15 years in Scorpio. It spends the most amount of time in Aries, Taurus, and Gemini, and the shortest amount of time in Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius, and then somewhere in between for the rest of the signs. But you can look at it through polarity, okay? So these are all polarities. Long time in Aries, short time in Libra, long time in Taurus, short time in Scorpio, long time in Gemini, short time in Sagittarius. And this is gonna just come more into play when we start talking about generational themes. But you know, when I was born, Pluto in Libra, Pluto was only spending 13 to 15 years in the sign. Okay. Whereas now we've already talked about Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008 and has been there ever since, which is considerably different. And so, it spends a longer time helping us to deal with some themes than others. Or, as a couple of my teachers would say, if Pluto spent any more time than it does in Scorpio, we probably wouldn't make it through. Okay. Any questions about any of that? So, something I want to say just before something for you to just kind of keep in mind through this lecture, through Pluto and Aquarius, is what is your heart made of? What do you love the most? What is your divine spark of genius? Okay, so this is kind of this bigger theme of like, what are you here to contribute to the world? That does not have to be like you in a position of historical significance. That could be that you just like one day save a frog off of a path. Okay, but what is it that you have to contribute? Maybe it's a little bit more than saving a frog off a path. I went on a walk this morning. I'm on the coast, house sitting for a friend, and I was like walking out by these marshes, and there were so many freaking frogs and salamanders all over the path. And I was like, I don't want to step on any of you. A lot of them had gotten squished already. Okay, good talk. So again, when we're talking about this, when we're talking about the switch between Pluto and Capricorn, Pluto and Aquarius, we are toggling between cardinal energy, Capricorn, and fixed energy, Aquarius. I already talked about teleological processes. Good work, brain. Okay. So let's just talk a little bit about Pluto and Capricorn. I can't remember my slides. Okay. So I just put the ingress chart here. So Pluto did spend about a year going between Sagittarius and Capricorn before it finally stuck. So this is the last ingress. November 26th, 2008. What was happening then? We elected our first Black president just a couple weeks before this. And so you can see that in the shift of Pluto into Capricorn, but you can also see that in that we had Saturn opposing Uranus at that time. And there's a lot of talk in Astrolandia about status quo. That would be John McCain facing off with change, Obama. There's Uranus. That was kind of when I was coming into understanding astrology as a collective thing. And I was like, so cool. Okay. So Pluto in Capricorn has been teaching us about the nature of power, really, since 2008. So in particular, we've been waking up to manipulations and abuses of power through our institutions. Political power, the power of wealth, which is, economics are embedded into our system. And when Pluto entered Capricorn, we had a financial crisis. Okay, so the financial crisis started earlier than November of 2008. It was a little bit earlier, but it was during that switch from Sag into Capricorn. And it's like our beliefs about wealth, our beliefs, Sagittarius, about our economic structures. There's Capricorn. Now, it's interesting that as we have Pluto leaving Capricorn, we have another banking crisis happening. And so there's been the opportunity to, after the 2008 crash, there was new regulations that came into place so that, we did away with the whole like too big to fail banking thing. But regulations came into place. There's Capricorn. So now they're being tested, essentially, as Pluto leaves Capricorn. And I don't think we've heard the end of that story, but more on that in a bit. So part of what's happening with Pluto and Capricorn is the veil is being lifted, not just on inequities in the system, not just on like the power dynamics in our infrastructures, but like where those foundations came from. Okay, the ways that racism is systemic in our institutions. Capricorn is about institutions, infrastructure, social contracts, the things that make society work. Now, it's also important to note that the last time Pluto was in Capricorn was in the late 1700s. So when this country was becoming a country, the American Revolutionary War started with Pluto in Capricorn. The United States birth chart has Pluto in Capricorn. So we've been going through the United States Pluto return. I have done a lot of lectures and other things on that. Please search the archives so that I don't end up talking for an hour about it. But it is this kind of soul-making process of this country in particular, the country that I live in the last couple of years, as we have our first Pluto return. And Pluto returns for countries are oftentimes that are very make or break. So there can be collapse, there can be healing. So one dynamic of Capricorn is that of repression and guilt. And we're seeing a lot about the ways that those are at play in our societies across the world. We're seeing a lot about the ways capitalism does and does not work. And we're seeing a lot about the ways that people, institutions, corporations deny that. And then another key thing about Pluto and Capricorn has been about sustainability. What is sustainable and what is not? So I'm talking at the collective level, but in your life as well. Part of the Pluto and Capricorn lesson is what is sustainable for me and what is not. And so that's going to be one of those key questions to think about as you know, Pluto's going back and forth between the two, kind of wrapping up loose ends there. What is sustainable for me and what is not? So Pluto in Capricorn has exposed the harsh realities of our social systems, our structures, our infrastructures. It's revealed entrenched power systems. And so one of the major techniques of evolutionary astrology is that we look for the Pluto polarity point, which is something that we can look to like actively engage with. So if you think about astrology, the zodiac is being a system of polarities. Capricorn is the opposite of Cancer. So Pluto in Capricorn is essentially saying like Capricorn's been overdone. So stretching to the opposite, Cancer, is a way to kind of like bring it back to the middle. So how are we building in systems of care, gentleness, softness, recognition that bodies can't push, right? Like as Pluto has come to the end of Capricorn, there's the whole thing about like grind culture. You know, it's not sustainable. Okay. So there's been some defining features of Pluto in Capricorn. One of them was the Uranus-Pluto square, which took place approximately between 2011 and 2016-ish. So Pluto in Capricorn squaring Uranus and Aries, when these two come into a hard aspect with each other, we see social revolution, we see rebellion, we see essentially like the Lord of Lightning Bolts throwing lightning bolts down into the earth. And the way that this took shape during those years started with Arab Spring and the Occupy movement, and essentially that, you know, understanding that, holy crap, there's a lot of elite people, wealthy people who are holding not just power for the world, but they're holding the resources and the money for the world. Okay, so you start, it's not like that was a new thing, but during that period in time, it intensifies. And a lot of other things went on in that time too. But then it's interesting because a couple of the other defining features of that have been that once we had the Uranus-Pluto square, then Saturn has come through and crystallized those lessons through a significant conjunction with Pluto in January of 2020. Saturn-Pluto conjunctions are known as cycles of crisis and contraction. And the day that that alignment was exact was the day that the World Health Organization announced that we had a virus of concern in China. And you can see the ways that the pandemic has exposed the, what's the word I want to use? The ways that our social safety net institutions and structures are crumbling. And then Saturn came in and started interfacing with Uranus, crystallizing the lessons of Uranus from this Uranus-Pluto square. And so throughout 2021 and through the last half of 2022, we saw extreme weather events. And again, just more like revelation around ways that our society needs to shift in order to handle what's happening with climate collapse, what's happening with globalization, what's happening, like pandemic preparedness things. So again, like all the institutions and social systems are needing a renovation, essentially. Any questions? Plutocracy. Yes. Totally. The word plutocracy really started getting used with Pluto and Capricorn. That was another one of those moments. The other big one, I think, for me was that when Uranus entered Aries, therefore kind of igniting the Pluto-Uranus square, was the same day that the earthquake happened in Japan in Fukushima, so March of 2011, and you saw literally like earthquake and then tsunami hitting a nuclear power plant, so colliding with innovation, Uranus, and it was like one of those very visceral visual displays of the archetypes at work. Still spewing contaminated radioactive water into the ocean, by the way. It's been a real long time. Okay, moving on. So Pluto in Aquarius. I have just a couple of the many things here. I've just started really digging into the history of Pluto and Aquarius periods, and I'll come back to this, but many thanks to Mel Lafara at Energetic Principles for on her recent podcast naming all of the different periods in the common area of Pluto and Aquarius. You can see them here, but I've just kind of started going through and like seeing what's going on in these periods and how it relates and resonates. And I've been just like thinking about things in history that I think are Pluto and Aquarius, and then going and checking dates, and that's been pretty fun too. So do I not have a slide for Aquarius? All right. So Pluto in Aquarius periods are associated with technological developments that revolutionize our way of life. Sometimes it's tricky to talk about these things because we're all going to have like our assumptions about them being like positive or negative. And so I always encourage you to think about it neutrally. Okay, because sometimes our lives get revolutionized in ways that are fantastic, and sometimes in ways that are not that great. And sometimes there's just a lot of like overlapping complications, right? TikTok is great and also terrible. There's a technological development for you. So during the last Pluto in Aquarius period, we had the end of the American Revolutionary War. We had the French Revolutionary Wars. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but the footage out of Paris looks strangely like something you might have imagined seeing in the 1700s, complete with like barricades and fire. And I don't think it's a bunch of people. Well, I know it's not a bunch of people who sat around and were like, oh, we should just recreate what was happening with Pluto and Aquarius. It's essentially like they came to a breaking point because their president has raised the age of retirement. And after the original French Revolution, I mean, the French Revolutionary Wars was like a smaller period of time, but the French Revolution was an extended period of time where they were essentially coming up with the ethos of the country, and they did not want capitalism to be king in the country. They did not want to be a country that in which people made money off the backs of others. And so Macron has been trying to get this essentially changed, this increase in the retirement age ever since he was elected, but the pandemic hit and he couldn't, and it did not pass the houses of parliament. He pushed it through last Thursday, and that's when this all started. And so it's a very, very similar echo to what was going on then, which was essentially the people no longer wanted the monarchy. Conditions had gotten terrible. If you want to see more, I just highly recommend watching the musical version of Les Miserables. But we're seeing it again, which is wild. And then the Haitian Revolution was happening during that time as well. One of the things that I thought was interesting was that in 1781, Immanuel Kant published his most popular book, which was called The Critique of, I have it written down, The Critique of Pure Reason. And this is an interesting thing because Kant was born in the 1700s, but part of what his work did, which was very, very impactful to modern philosophy, was he essentially, well, the takeaway that many people took from his work was that human consciousness cannot be subject to the scientific method. There's no empirical science that can research human consciousness, and therefore we'll just leave it aside, because what's most important is what is physical, material, and rational. And so nothing else should be taken into consideration. And his work was actually extremely much more complex and nuanced than that. But again, like the solidification that was taken out, think like a fixed sign, rigidifying something, was very much that. So that the translation has essentially been like, don't bother with understanding human consciousness because you cannot apply the scientific method to it, which has shaped a lot of the philosophy of the last 250 years. So I would expect some kind of something or other. I actually saw an article yesterday in a magazine that I respect a lot that was essentially making fun of the fact that we're still talking about things like soul in this day and age when it's just a relic of our religious past. So I would expect to see more of that kind of thing happening. We did have the Luddite resistance to the technological revolution happening during the last Pluto in Aquarius. So just kind of a counterpoint there. Is there anything else that folks have heard about that they want to bring up right now?
I'll just jump in on, a nuance of the Luddite resistance. It wasn't just people hating on technology because it was revolutionary. Some of it was also the, okay, you want more efficiency and you want, what happens to people? Like what happens to the collective because of this? That was some of also what was feeding it. Not the hate on technology for technology's sake. I think sometimes it gets shorthanded like that a lot.
Oh yeah, the kind of like colloquial use of it is like, don't be a Luddite.
Yeah. And I think that also resonates with these themes, like, okay, the change could be neutral, but then what is going on with the people, the people that are here, the collective.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a really good point because, and this gets into the, two glyphs that I have in the bottom right here, which is that, Aquarius is ruled by Saturn, but a modern astrologer will tell you that there's a significantly strong resonance with Uranus. And this can come through in a lot of ways because Aquarius as an archetype is very much about understanding the systems at play. So not in the Capricorn, like the system of like bureaucracy and tax management or like our institutions, but like, how we are connected as a community, how we are connected within our networks of people and how those networks work and how like human connection and communal resources sustain us. The fixed signs are about resources. So Taurus, my resources, Leo, how I express what I have. Scorpio, shared resources on a one-on-one basis, and then Aquarius, communal resources. And so I think that Aquarius at its best is kind of thinking about, like Christina was just saying, like, what are the impacts of this long term? Aquarius air sign can see into the future, not through like some like, woo, but because it takes all the information available and synthesizes it and can see a lot of potential outcomes, like likely potential outcomes. And so sometimes you'll hear Aquarian type folks called idealists, and sometimes you'll hear them called fatalists. And I bet if you ask an Aquarian, they would just say, I'm being realistic based on the given set of like information. I think this is what's going to happen. And so, you know, it can be stubborn for the sake of saying like, no, does this really work? It can be stubborn for the sake of stubbornness. It can be rebellious for the sake of rebellion, which is what the Luddites kind of get tagged as. But at the same time, it's trying to like make sure that things work, Saturn. It's also about reforming what is not working. So we can think of reforming in terms of very Saturnian, forming something, but also when things aren't working, Aquarius will change it. It will tear things down. It will break things down. Think rebellion in order to change it. And so in that, it kind of contains both the Saturnian and the Uranian archetypes. Okay. So some more kind of words for Aquarius. So, you know, an archetype, a zodiacal archetype is going to contain the highs and the lows, the positives and the negatives, the light and the shadow side of things. With Pluto, we are skewing more towards the shadow or the negative, with the option of consciously reaching towards the positive. But especially when we're thinking about things like collective astrology, the collective is not that conscious. And so the manifestation tends towards the shadowier side of things. So revolution, fragmentation, you know, we live in a world with a lot of trauma. Trauma causes fragmentation. This is an Aquarian phenomena. Liberation, exiling elitism. So I think that the next 20 years are going to be a time where we can become more communally minded. I think that there's a potential for like social stratification and hierarchies to diminish, but it's going to take a lot of work. And so in that, I think that there's a significant potential for social stratification and elitism to get a lot worse than it is now. So again, this is where we have to like work towards the version of it that we want. And I don't want that version. Hubris is definitely an Aquarius thing. So the Aquarius Leo axis is where we try to metabolize our godliness with our humanity, right? Leo inflated becomes like, I am the source of the divine spark, and therefore should be centered, worshiped, and revered. It loses sight of the fact that like we are here as a vessel for the divine. Okay, so it can have that inflation, it can have that contact with God, and then an internalization that I am God. And so that polarity stretches into that, like having to zoom out of that and get perspective. At the same time, where Leo can become that kind of like narcissistic vortex of like, I am the center of the universe, Aquarius can get so cold and so cut off from the heart that it loses touch with its humanity. It always makes me think about there's a book called Dreaming the End of the World that's about the beginning of nuclear energy, and it talks about the scientists at that time and how, you know, like Oppenheimer's quoted as saying that they had the most delicious little riddle because they had to figure out how to detonate the bomb. They had to make sure that the chances of it igniting the Earth's atmosphere were like less than 1 in 1,000 or whatever. They were just working with like probabilities. And in order to do that kind of thing, you have to separate yourself from your humanity at some level. Right? It's like sometimes I say, are surgeons or sociopaths? Right? Like they have to, like, they're little, like they're cutting people up all the time. And sometimes when I am interacting with surgeons, which I've done a lot in my life, I'm just like, is there any empathy in there? No offense to anybody who has surgeons in their lives. I'm sure that they're great. But anyway, there is that like, how do I stay in touch with my humanity? That's very much a part of this polarity. So individuation, the process of becoming who you were meant to be. I keep saying like hearing your divine spark and moving into it. Consciousness itself. This question of what constitutes consciousness is going to be a huge one. And we can already see that with all of this AI stuff that's starting. Pluto in Aquarius with Saturn in Pisces in particular, and AI is going to become a gigantic topic. So what are the true costs of technological innovation? What about emotional intelligence through understanding the logic of the heart? That's what keeps Aquarius warm. Is the freedom that's achieved through labor and suffering of others worth it? That was a question that Jessica Lanyadoo threw out in her podcast when she was talking about Pluto and Aquarius. And thinking about Aquarius as the communal and community oriented. So Pluto brings fundamental reckonings relative to the sign that it's in. So in Capricorn, fundamental reckonings regarding the way power works in our societal systems and opportunities for accountability. And in Aquarius, I imagine it will bring fundamental reckonings regarding the integration of our humanity and our godliness. So what does it mean to be human? And giving us opportunities for truth and freedom. Aquarius is the truth teller of the zodiac. Don't let any Sagittarius make you believe it's them. It's Aquarius. Aquarius is hard truths. Think Saturn. So we have themes emerging. I've already said AI. What is consciousness? I've had my blood run cold a couple times in the past couple months when I listen to or read stuff about what's happening with AI. Elitism, I've already mentioned, our use of technology, the seduction of technology and the obsession with technology is already huge. Going to be bigger. And that's specifically it's not, I'm not just saying like it's going to get worse. I mean, it might, but my point is, again, to be thinking about it. What is the shadow side of these things? What are the unexamined parts of these themes? How do we bring ethics and morality to technology, to technological innovation, aside from getting rid of capitalism altogether, which I'm all for? But that's a longer term goal. Algorithms, right? Again, how do we bring ethics and morals to things like algorithms? There are ways to do it. I listened to a podcast about that recently and how like there's been a couple legal proceedings at the Supreme Court level and then at the congressional level where companies are being asked to like moderate things, and they're like, well, but if we moderate things, then blah, 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 blah. And it's just like there's no precedent for any of this, and we live in a society where there isn't like a standard ethical approach to things, and so I think that's going to become bigger. Revolutions in thought, revolutions in the streets, alternative living arrangement styles, communal living. I mean, everyone I know talks about communal living all the time, but are we going to actually do it in the next 20 years? Maybe. I need a retirement plan. I won't be retired in 20 years. Okay, any questions or comments about any of that?
Not to like get all sci-fi and continue on like the alien that I was saying earlier, but it
It's
did
okay.
kind
We
of
can
like
all
pop.
we can all see that you're an Aquarius.
I am an Aquarius, so it is going to get weird. But I was just thinking, like, what are your thoughts on time travel, and like would that be a Pluto and Aquarius theme, just in theory, not like in that okay time travel is going to happen with Pluto and Aquarius, but like I'm just thinking in terms of like the archetypes and the themes. Um and the only reason I thought about that is because I kind of went down a little bit of a rabbit hole just whenever we were talking. Earlier today, I had a conversation with someone and we were talking about, like where it used to be like, oh, back in my day, you used to have to write a letter to see your friend, or you used to have to go knock on someone's door. And now we're going to be like, oh, I remember when you used to have to text someone before you came over. And now you just like teleport into their living room, like we were talking about like what it was going to be like and that kind of thing. And it made me think of time travel in like a quantum physics type of way. And I'm just curious your thoughts if you would see like the themes in that.
Yeah. 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 I'm trying to pull out a thread to go with. The first thing that popped into my head when you said that was so Joanna Macy's work has a notion of the ancestors of the future, present, and the past. And so like connecting with our future, present, and past selves. And so that's not like time travel in terms of like you get into a little TARDIS and then you like travel, blah, 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 blah. Like maybe, I don't know. But I think about it in terms of revolutions in consciousness. Because consciousness can time travel. I mean, you're talking to a past life regression therapist. I time travel all the time with clients. And we go in all directions with it. And so I would imagine that, I mean, is that Pluto in Aquarius specifically? So here's the other thing, and this is getting into future slides, but it's worth saying now that, we've got a lot of overlapping astrology going on all the time. And one of the things that has happened in recent history is that at the end of 2020, Jupiter and Saturn came into a conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius, initiating a new 200-year cycle that's focused on air. So the previous one was focused on Earth. And so because it's Jupiter and Saturn, how does all this stuff stay in my mind? So since it's Jupiter and Saturn, we're dealing with like society and culture. And since it's air, we're dealing with, how we think about things and the mind and technology and communication and all of those things. So part of what's happening with Pluto and Aquarius then is that it's bringing more energy to that 0 degrees Aquarius point, right? Like it was really auspicious that alignment happened. The Jupiter Saturn, auspicious that it was 0 degrees Aquarius because that didn't have to happen, but also because I don't know if you remember like looking up in the sky at Jupiter and Saturn coming together and just being like, oh, right, there's the bright star, especially happening in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic, right? It was just like some kind of breathtaking sight. So that's kind of the first riff on it. The other thing I think about is like ways that with Saturn and Pisces, like time travel through hallucinogens and psychedelics might be coming into the mix more. But I think that as time travel comes in, like the most important thing for me to keep in mind is that I don't think we can imagine the mechanism through which it happens yet. Now, some quantum physicists might be able to, but I am not science literate enough to be able to go with them there. Anything else from anyone? Quantum computing, yes. Okay. I was thinking, I don't have that much more to talk about. Now I'm like, oh, I have more slides. I just remembered what's on all of them. Okay, great. So we're in a foreshadowing phase right now. And that's because of that kind of dance. Like Pluto's going to go into Aquarius for just like, 2.5 months, and then back into Capricorn, and then it'll go into Aquarius again, then back into Capricorn. So we're looking for clues as to the themes, and that's at the collective level and at the personal level. And so, these initial couple of years are just going to be foreshadowing for you personally if you have planets or points in early Aquarius. And by early Aquarius, I mean like 0 to 2 degrees. 3 would be pushing it, because Pluto's just going to be going like up into 0 degrees and then back, and then up into 1 degree and then back. So what happens with the back and forth between now and September 2024 gives us clues as to the predominant themes of Pluto's sign time in Aquarius. And so we're looking at these ingress charts. So this is for the moment that Pluto goes into Aquarius on March 23rd at 5:23 a.m. Okay, so you can see Pluto here at 0 degrees of Aquarius. So like, what else is going on in the chart? Sometimes these ingress charts will give us like a feel for the themes and the flavors and the textures. So the biggest thing with this chart to me is that we have Sun, Mercury, Chiron, Jupiter, and the Moon all in Aries. It is a highly initiatory chart. This is saying very loudly, like, big change is happening. Something new is starting. It does not always line up that way, that an ingress chart looks like that. It's pretty profound. We also have Saturn newly in Pisces, and we have Mars in the anaretic degree, the last degree of Gemini. New. We also have Pluto squaring the nodes. So Pluto at 0 degrees with the nodes at 4 degrees of blah, blah, Scorpio and Taurus. So this Pluto square the nodes is going to be the case for a bit. It's going to be the case with Pluto in Aquarius and back into Capricorn, and it's going to be the case with the nodes in Taurus, Scorpio, and the nodes in Aries, Libra, because they're going to switch in mid-July. I believe I have a slide for this. Let me see. So let's talk about that right now. So Pluto squaring the lunar nodes is going to be within a 5-degree orb from March to December. It will be at its tightest in July. When the exact square happens on July 22nd, it's actually very rare because the nodes are going to station. And so it's kind of like they're being held. And this is really important because this is Pluto coming back into the territory of the United States Pluto return. There's a lot of other astrology happening at that time. I expect there to be a lot of heat on the American political stage. My guess would be around issues of bodily autonomy, and probably some other things. So when a planet squares the nodes, we are learning to work with emotional resistance. I'm sorry, when Pluto squares the nodes, we are learning to work with emotional resistance. And Pluto square the nodes can be super resistant to working with those emotions. So this will probably be true at the collective level. You'll see uprisings based in like stuck emotions. At the personal level, this would be most true for you if you have planets or points near like, 27 Capricorn, 27 Cardinal to 2 fixed ish. And so this resistance to change is because the emotions can be so intense. We're thinking Pluto. So a planet squaring the nodes is talking about essentially like a fundamental hiccup when it comes to our evolution, when it comes to changing. It's something that happens over and over again that spins us out into an emotional reality that we can't deal with. And so we fall back into our habits and patterns. What would the habits and patterns of the United States be? Punishment, use of force. We could probably think of a lot of other Capricornian themes for that. But for the first part of it, so back here, Pluto square the nodes in Scorpio Taurus, the resolution node is going to be the Scorpio node. And so this is showing us that there is a necessity for radical, honest, emotional truth, and for going in through and processing deep emotion. You know, and so I think that's just something to keep in mind. Does that mean that you're going to be thrown into heavy emotional material? I don't know. I don't think that's going to be true for every individual person. But if it does come up, yeah, facing the emotions honestly to the best of your ability can be really important. This is also really putting a little emphasis on the mental health crisis that we have going on worldwide. There needs to be solutions, and they have to do with emotional processing. Does that mean that the Taurus North Node is out of the mix entirely? No, it's still important to find pleasure. It's still important to learn how to be present in the moment through mindfulness. It's still important to focus on things like resources. Are my survival needs met? If not, how can I get them met? With Pluto square the nodes from Capricorn, I think the way to consciously work with the energy is to do some kind of like excavation work related to the roles that you play, related to things like internalized misogyny, anti-oppression work, ways that civility and like ways that I think that like white folks in particular tend to be really attached to the identity of niceness, or to the identity of being a good person. There's Libra, but I'm a good person, right? So again, Libra has to do with the roles we play, the masks that we wear, what's going on underneath the surface. And since it's that Pluto and Capricorn again, issues of inequality and oppression come front and center. Another question with Pluto and Capricorn, and just kind of sticking with that because this is so emphasized in July, is like questions of, do people deserve punishment? What kind? Do you deserve punishment? Do you fear punishment? How much does punishment control it? Control the way that you act? Again, keeping in mind the fact that Plutonian stuff is deep. You're not going to get there by just being like, do I believe in punishment? Okay, no. You got to like sit with it and go to the uncomfortable places. Or it's an invitation to, I should say. With the Aquarius piece, when, where, why, how do you detach from empathy? Without judgment, right? When you're asking yourself these questions, it's not like, oh God, I detached from empathy because I'm bad. Usually there's some kind of like survival mechanism at play, right? Or an attempt to keep yourself from feeling too much, which isn't inherently bad. So we want to take the judgment out of these things. Okay. Any questions about that? There's so much cool astrology going on. OMG. Okay, so the second ingress, July 20th of 2024. I think the coolest thing about this is that the sun will be at 0 degrees Aquarius as well. And so this is really bringing emphasis back to that point of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction and amping up the Aquarian themes. I think that there's also a lot in these charts about wealth and money, and we'll see that again in a moment. And then the final ingress, we have the thing that's most interesting to me about this one is that Pluto is going to be moving into a trine with Uranus. So it's still wide at this point, but Uranus is going to enter Gemini, and then they'll be held in a trine for about 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, somewhere in that range. And that is great. I'm stoked to see some astrology that looks really good. But if you think about it as part of the Pluto Uranus cycle, Pluto and Uranus were last together in a conjunction in the mid to late 60s. And then all of those themes from the mid to late 60s come to a crisis point, 2011 to 2016, when they're squaring each other. I'm making a square with my hands. And then they come into the trine. And so there's some kind of like potential stabilization happening there. They're working more harmonious with each other. Hooray. I already looked at that one. What's this one? Oh, another slide about the squares. Oh, no, it's not. Okay. Oh, so May 20th, I got my eye on, it's an interesting chart. But Mars and Pluto will be in an opposition at 0 degrees with Jupiter squaring conjunct the North Node. So Mars and Pluto are at the midpoint of a 2-year cycle at this point. They were conjunct in March of 2020, if you want to look at what's going on for you then. This is also the modern and traditional rulers of the South nodes squaring each other. Opposing each other while squaring the nodes. So we have a double nodal square going on here. So deeply buried anger could be a theme for some, among other things. I think that there's also a kind of mandate here, or an invitation for the heart, your heart, to go after what it wants. Like there is, when we link a planet into Pluto like this, there is an evolutionary mandate to go after something that's based in the desires of the soul and the desires of the ego serving the desires of the soul. So, I don't know, like, I guess at the more personal level, like if new relationships start at this time, they're probably pretty karmic. Then we're going to head into like a Venus retrograde season in Leo as well. Or it could just be like drawing something into your orbit generally that's fundamental to your evolution. So just kind of paying attention during that time to what's going on. I think at the world stage, we will see something related to resources. There's too much about Jupiter conjunct the North Node related to resources and wealth. Hopefully some kind of lovely breakthrough, whatever it is, will be traveling with us through until Jupiter conjuncts Uranus, which will happen in 2024. And that's usually a pretty exciting and positive cycle. So the Pluto polarity point I talked about a little bit earlier, but this is kind of an energy that we can make a point of consciously bringing in. So it's a way of bringing the polarity of Aquarius back to the center. So thinking about the fact that only the heart is big enough to hold space for what it is to be a human right now. One of the things that Jason Hawley said at a lecture I went to a couple months ago about Pluto and Aquarius had to do with just like the level of information that we now have access to and what we're asked to metabolize on a day-to-day basis when it comes to just like exposure to information. And the mind can't hold it. The nervous system can't hold that. The heart is what creates a vessel that's big enough to like be spacious and be present for what's happening. So leaning into the wisdom of the heart, leaning into heart coherence. How do you do that? I mean, there's lots of different ways, but I always go back to spiritual practice, spirituality, daily practice. If you think about the Aquarius Leo polarity, it is thinking with the head and the heart. Right? So pushing us to be in the heart together in community with each other. There's an integration of Leo and Aquarius. I'm skipping through a lot of my notes because I want to talk about this. So we have, so Pluto has a lot to do with generations in astrology, and it's more complex than that, but like Pluto and Leo is a generation. Pluto and Scorpio is a generation of people that have a similar baseline, a similar base note going on. It actually describes the generations way better than demographers do in terms of timing. But something that's really interesting is that when you think about generational astrology, so we all have different transits going on at a given amount of time, but there are some that happen at the same age for everyone. So the Saturn return's the most well-known one. It happens between 28 and 30. La 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 la. Everyone has their Saturn return at about the same age. So we also have something like a Pluto opposition, which is going to start happening for Pluto and Leos. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. One of them is that not everyone will have a Pluto opposition in their lifetime. I will not live to have a Pluto opposition because of Pluto's wacky orbital period. All right. So folks with Pluto and Leo will start going through their Pluto oppositions. Not everyone will experience it because it's a large generation, right? Like it's folks born over a 15-year period. But those at the eldest of them will start going through it. And so there's significant cultural implications of a transit that's impacting people in power. And one thing that's very true for Pluto and Leos in power is that a lot of them don't want to give up that power. A lot of their self-worth and identity. And I'm thinking about like politicians. I'm not thinking about people who are with us tonight or like the many Pluto and Leos that I have in my life who are wonderful. But I'm thinking of, collective themes. And it's a generation that's very entrenched in power because it is, it's attached to their feelings of worth as a human. I need to be center stage, essentially. Why do we have politicians in their 80s who have been serving for 20 years? Right. So like elders in community, heck yeah, give us that wisdom, but that's not the role that they're playing. So it's a generation that has Aquarius as their natal Pluto polarity point, letting go of that subjective focus and moving into what is good for the collective. So there's an opportunity there for that. The other thing is that Pluto and Scorpio folks are going to start having their Pluto squares. So Pluto squares are interesting because, again, due to Pluto's wacky orbit, they happen at different times for different generations. Ever since I was time traveling today with my astrology software. Ever since the mid Pluto in Leos, the Pluto square has been happening in the late 30s for folks. If we go back to Pluto in Gemini, it happens in the 70s. So now that we're entering Pluto and Scorpio having their Pluto square, we're starting to move to the elder ages. So like the early Pluto and Scorpios are going to have their Pluto square happen around 40. So like 39 to 41-ish. But it's going to start getting later and later through the course of that generation so that, oh, where did I write this down? Hold on. So like folks born in 1987 are going to have it around age 39. Folks born in 1990, Pluto and Scorps will have it around age 41. And then by the time we get to the 1995 Pluto and Scorps, it'll be age 44. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. One is that the Pluto square is not the only midlife transit. You also have a Neptune square, a Saturn opposition, and a Uranus opposition. So like for my generation, we had the Pluto square first, hit hard and heavy, and then we got Neptune square, Saturn opposition, Uranus opposition. The Pluto and Scorps are going to have a lot of these at the same time, or they will have Neptune square first, then Pluto square, and then Saturn opposition and Uranus opposition. So the kind of order of operations for that process of coming into yourself in your midlife changes a lot, which I think is in some ways kind of a break for Pluto and Scorpios, because not all, but a lot of Pluto and Scorpios have a lot of planets in Capricorn, outer planets in Capricorn, and they were forced to kind of come into age early, maturity early. And so they're getting a little bit of a breather, but having the Pluto square at the same time as all the other ones is quite a bit. So we'll see how that all shakes out, but it's very interesting. Any questions or comments about that? Okay, so wrapping up in 4 minutes. Tips. Where is Aquarius in your chart? What planets, angles, or points do you have in 1 to 2 degrees of Aquarius? Those are areas of life, parts of your personality that are going to be transforming. So how can you facilitate that process? Pluto pushes for healing. If it brings up pain, suffering, or harsh lessons, it's for the sake of healing. So how can you be proactive about that? And base it in your connection to the wider world. What Pluto and Capricorn loose ends do you need to take care of to support your personal transition into Pluto and Aquarius? If there are things, like if I say that, there are things that you're like, oh, I haven't been doing that one. I've just been hoping that this transit passes. You might as well just do it. You might as well just do it now, face it now. What Pluto, already said that. Remember, working with astrology gives the opportunity to bring consciousness to whatever arises and needs to arise. How can you come into greater coherence with your heart? I mean, laughter, doing things that bring you joy, thinking about what you liked doing, eating, listening to as a child, and bringing that into your life now. Looking at artwork and then like closing your eyes and imagining the artwork in your head and then letting it drop into your heart and noticing what you feel in that process. Dancing, playing, music, romance, all good Leo medicines. What does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to pursue autonomy? What is liberation? How can I speak truth to power? Leo roars in the face of injustice, a lot of things. Where Libra would take the diplomatic approach. Leo is like, I'm the lion. Hear me roar. Okay. Final slide, upcoming stuff. I'm probably going to do a general chart reading or synthesis series. I'm still working it out, but email me if that's something you're interested in. That will encourage me to work it out a little bit more. I'm going to rerun Practical Woo, which I do every 2 years or so. It'll still be a 6-part class the way that it always is, but it's probably going to be spread out to give people a longer time to like work with all of it because it's so much material. But it's a really freaking great class. It introduces you to like various ways to build a witchy practice, a spiritual practice, your connection with the 4 elements, the directions. It's very beginner friendly. So I'm excited about that one. Like I said already, April and May Astro Circles are going to be more experiential and I won't be prepping lectures for them, which is awesome. And then in June and July, we'll be focusing on Venus stuff. And I don't know what's coming after that, but I'll figure it out soon. And then I've got a bunch of conferences and public lectures coming up. So stay tuned for those. Check out those things on my website if you want more information. Okay. Questions, comments, needs. What's up?
That was great. Thank you.
You're welcome. My brain felt so clear and functional. That's so nice when that happens.
I love what you said, Amanda, about remembering what you love as a child, because I just came back from farm sitting and I brought a coloring book and like 400 color pencils. And I had a blast. And it was just so peaceful and meditative. So thank you
Yeah.
for saying that. Yeah,
Mhm.
it was
Yeah,
lovely.
sometimes it's really simple things.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think I saw someone else unmute themselves, but I can't remember who it was. Okay. Well, if you're a Patreon person and you want to stick around for a little bit of new moon ritual,